previous segment, we saw that it was wheat that domesticated Homo sapiens rather than the other way around, and that the new way of life of Homo sapiens, the agricultural way of life, was quite hard and difficult, especially when compared to the previous way of life of sapiens. How did wheat then convince Homo sapiens to exchange a rather good life for a more miserable existence? What did it offer in return? Now, it's very clear that wheat did not offer people a better diet. Remember that as we spoke in previous lessons, humans are omnivorous apes. They thrive by eating a very wide variety of different foodstuffs. Grains, like wheat, made up only a small fraction of the human diet before the agricultural revolution. A diet which is based mainly on grains and cereals is poor in minerals and vitamins. It's hard to digest, and it's really bad for your teeth and for your gums. Your body, your digestive systems, your teeth, they did not evolve for hundreds of thousands of years to eat mainly cereals and grains. So wheat did not offer a better diet. Wheat also did not offer people economic security. The life of a peasant is usually less secure than the life of a hunter-gatherer. The reason for this is because peasants, at least hundreds of years ago and thousands of years ago, they subsisted mainly by growing and eating one type or two or three types of plants. Like in China, they ate mainly rice and rice and rice. In the Middle East, they grew and ate barley and wheat and barley and wheat. In Central America, most of the things that they ate was just maize, corn. And it's a very insecure basis for the economy of the private person and of the collective when most of your food comes from just one or two types of domesticated plants like rice or wheat. Because if there is some calamity, if there is drought, or if there is flooding, or if there is some parasite that destroys the annual wheat field, the annual wheat crop or rice crop, there is nothing else to eat, and peasants die in their thousands or in millions. In contrast, hunter-gatherers enjoy better economic security because they gather and hunt and eat a lot of different foodstuffs. If there is some calamity and one particular foodstuff is scarce this year, then we can hunt or gather larger quantities of other things. So wheat did not offer more economic security. Also, wheat did not offer better security against human violence, just the opposite. The early farmers in the villages and towns were probably as violent and more violent than their forager ancestors. Because what happened is that in the transition to agriculture, humans had less room for compromise in their conflicts and confrontations. When a foraging band, say 30,000 years ago, came into conflict with another band which was stronger than it, and they fought or they had a conflict about, say, who should hunt in a particular valley, a foraging band in such circumstances, when it saw that it was losing, could usually move on to a different place. It was difficult and it was dangerous, but in general it was feasible. However, in the case of peasants, of agriculture, of villages and towns, when a strong enemy threatened an agricultural village, retreat, going somewhere else, meant to give up the fields, to give up the houses, the granaries, and this probably doomed the refugees to death by starvation. So even if you're attacked by a more powerful enemy, the best thing to do, the only thing to do, was to fight to the bitter end. Because if you try to go somewhere else, you'll die anyway from starvation. So why not stay and fight? And this is why conflict between ancient agricultural societies tended to be even more ferocious, more violent, with less room for compromise than conflict between hunter-gatherers. There are many anthropological and archaeological studies that indicate that in simple agricultural societies, human violence was responsible for about 15% of all human death, including 25% of male death. The chance of a male, of a man, in an ancient agricultural village, say 8,000 years ago, the chance of a man to die at the hands of another man was 25%. Today in the world, it's about 1.5, even 1% and less, depending on where you live. 8,000 years ago, it was 25%. Your other people were probably the worst danger in your life. So wheat did not offer humans protection against violence by other humans, just the contrary. It actually led to an increase in violence. Violence eventually was lowered, was brought under control by the development of larger social framework like cities and kingdoms and empires. We will discuss it later. But it took thousands of years to build such huge and effective political structures. It did not happen immediately after the agricultural revolution. So at least at first, wheat did not offer people more security. Now all this is hard for people today in the prosperous societies of the 21st century to appreciate. Because we today, most of us today in the world, enjoy a relatively high degree of affluence and security compared to what most people in history enjoyed. And because our affluence and security are built on agricultural foundations, we tend to assume that the agricultural revolution was a wonderful improvement, was a big step forward. But it looks so only for the perspective of people today in the early 21st century. And it is wrong to judge thousands of years of history from the perspective of today. A much more representative viewpoint from which to judge history, to judge the agricultural revolution, is, for example, the perspective of a 3-year-old peasant girl dying from malnutrition in 1st century China. This girl had a much harder life than her ancestors tens of thousands of years earlier, and she did not know about us. She did not say to herself, okay, I'm now dying from malnutrition. But in 2,000 years' time, thanks to agriculture, people will have plenty to eat and will live in big and air-conditioned houses. So my sacrifice, my suffering is worthwhile. People in history did not think like that. They did not know about us. So it is wrong to judge the agricultural revolution from our perspective today. If so, the question arises, what did wheat offer farmers, peasants, including that malnourished Chinese girl? What did it offer that convinced people to adopt the difficult life of agriculture? The answer is that wheat did not offer anything for people as individuals. However, wheat did give something to Homo sapiens as a species, as a collective. Cultivating wheat provided much more food per unit of territory. For a given field, a given territory, Homo sapiens could get much more food if we used agriculture than if we hunted and gathered what grows naturally in that field. And all this extra food enabled the numbers of sapiens to grow exponentially. It enabled many more people to live in the same territory. Take, for example, the area around the oasis of Jericho in what is today Palestine, where one of the earliest villages, one of the first villages in history, began to grow about 9,000 years ago. So if you go back 13,000 years ago to the oasis of Jericho, when people still fed by gathering wild plants and hunting wild animals, you will find that the area around Jericho could support perhaps one roaming band of about 100 relatively healthy and relatively satiated people. Now, if you move forward to around 8000 BC, you will find that wild plants around Jericho gave way to wheat fields, and that the oasis of Jericho now supported a much larger number of people. It supported, say, a village of 1,000 people. Now, these people in Jericho 8,000 years ago, they were much more hungry, much less healthy, and probably less happy than their ancestors, the hunter-gatherers. However, there were many more of them. And unfortunately, evolution measures success not by hunger or pain or happiness and suffering. Evolution measures success by the numbers of copies of DNA in existence of a particular species. Just as the economic success of a company is measured only by the number of dollars in its bank account and not by the happiness of the workers or of the employees, so also the evolutionary success of a species is measured only by the number of copies of DNA in existence. If there are no more DNA copies of this particular species, this species is extinct and it is considered a failure, an evolutionary dead end. If the species has many copies of its DNA spreading around, then it is considered an evolutionary success. And from this narrow perspective, 1,000 copies are always better than 100 copies. And this is the essence of the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution means the ability to keep many more people alive under worse conditions. This is the agricultural revolution. Yet, a new question now arises. Okay, we understand that it is good for the species, agriculture, but why should people as individuals care about this evolutionary calculus, this benefit of the species as a whole? Why would any sane person agree to lower his or her standards of living just in order to multiply the numbers of copies of the Homo sapiens genome? One main answer to this question is that people really never agreed to the agricultural revolution. It was not a conscious one-time decision to move from hunting and gathering to agriculture. It was more like the accumulation of many small steps, and it's impossible to say that this step or that step was the decisive transition from being hunter-gatherers to being agriculturists, to being peasants. But it is clear that by 8500 BC, the Middle East was already peppered with permanent villages such as Jericho, whose inhabitants spent most of their time cultivating a few domesticated species like barley and like wheat. This is how they made their living. And as people relied more on cultivating domesticated species, and as people spent more and more time in the fields, sowing and watering and harvesting and so forth, so they had less and less time to go hunt and to go to forage. And they could not wander around. They had to stay in the village, close to the fields. At the same time, what also happened, very important, is that the population began to grow. There were more and more people around. First of all, and this is very obvious, because cultivation, agriculture, provided more food, so you could feed more people. But secondly, because giving up the nomadic lifestyle of wandering around in search of things to hunt and gather, giving up this nomadic lifestyle and settling in permanent villages enabled women to have a child, a baby, every year, instead of having a baby just every 3 or 4 years, as was the case with hunter-gatherers. Women hunter-gatherers usually were very careful to wait until the previous child could walk by himself or herself before having another baby. Because if you go around all the time and you have 2 children who can't walk, then you have to carry them and take care of them, and it's too difficult. In contrast, peasant women who lived in villages, they could have a child every year. And they were encouraged to have all these new babies because there was always work to be done in the fields. People could always use an extra pair of hands in the wheat fields. The problem was, of course, that all the new children, they had not only hands to work in the field, they also had mouth and stomachs, and they quickly ate all the extra food that agriculture provided. Moreover, infectious diseases began to spread rapidly among the growing population of peasants for several reasons. First of all, because more and more diseases, infectious diseases, jumped from domesticated animals to people. We discussed this previously, that most of the infectious diseases of humans, they actually originate in domesticated animals like chickens and pigs and cows, and hunter-gatherers did not suffer from them. But once people began to domesticate animals, then many of these diseases began to threaten human beings. Secondly, because people began to live in villages, their hygienic conditions deteriorated. Hunter-gatherers were walking in small groups all the time and did not stay close to their toilets and garbage piles. But peasants or town dwellers, they lived in much more crowded places, and they lived in close proximity to the garbage piles and to the toilets and to all kinds of other sick people and sick animals. And therefore, villages and towns quickly became hothouses for infectious diseases. So the disease came, say, from a cow, and then it infected one person, and one person infected in a crowded village or town quickly infected everybody else. So waves of epidemics began to threaten humankind. The third reason why people were suffering much more from disease, why people were less healthy, is because their diet was worse. Eating wheat porridge for breakfast, and then wheat bread for lunch, and then wheat gruel for supper is far less nutritious than eating nuts and mushrooms for breakfast, and then eating a turtle and blueberries for lunch, and then eating a bunch of bananas for dinner. So people ate a worse diet, and their immune system suffered. The greatest suffering, the greatest harm was done to babies. Hunter-gatherer babies, they subsisted for 2 or 3 years almost exclusively on the milk of their mothers. They were suckled to quite a big age. And mother's milk is the best diet for a human baby. Peasant babies, after the transition to agriculture, were weaned very early and were fed, instead of mother's milk, they were fed with porridge and gruel. And porridge and gruel is a terrible diet for human babies, much, much worse than mother's milk. It contains it doesn't contain many things that are needed, especially by the baby's immune system. So at the same time that there are more infectious diseases around, people ate a worse diet, and their immune system was less robust, less strong. And it is estimated that in most agricultural societies, as a result, at least a third of the babies born died before reaching adulthood from all kinds of infectious diseases. And not only babies and children, of course, many of the adults too suffered from these diseases, much more so than in the days of hunting and gathering. However, despite all the increase in disease and death, the increase in birth of new babies was still more. Birth still outpaced the increase in death, and as a result, there were more and more humans living in these villages and towns, even though they were less healthy. And even though, as we spoke earlier, they had a more difficult life in general, because as we said, cultivating fields, agriculture, is less suitable for the human mind and body than wandering in the forest in search of rabbits and deer and mushroom. Hence, with time, with the passing of the generation, this wheat bargain, the bargain between Homo sapiens and wheat, became more and more burdensome for Homo sapiens. Children died in droves, and adults had a very hard life of labor. The average person in Jericho of 8,500 BC lived a harder life than the average person in Jericho of, say, 13,000 BC. But nobody realized what was happening because it was not done in one day, but over the generations. Every generation continued to live like its parents, just a little more efficiently. They just invented a little something more to help them in agriculture. And paradoxically, a series of such improvements, each of which was meant to make life easier, like bringing water from the well to water the wheat, each of these improvements added together to a very, very heavy burden. Why then did people make such a fateful miscalculation? Why did they make all these tiny steps of improvement that added up to a very big burden? We will try to answer this question in the next segment.